feel of it, and then the way that the bass and the kick drum would be rubbing together, and think, ooh, boy.
Robbie Robertson and Levon Helm were both members of the band, and for a long time, they weren't just bandmates. They called each other brothers. They shared the road, the music, and a bond that looked solid from the outside. But that closeness didn't survive success. The relationship soured, lines were crossed, and the fallout became so deep it was never repaired before either man died. Before his death, Robbie Robertson finally spoke openly about what really happened between them. And in doing so, he revealed a side of Levon Helm that fans rarely heard about. So what did Robertson actually say about his former bandmate? And does his final account change the way we see Levon Helm? Let's get into it. Before the fall, how the band was forged, tested, and changed. Rock forever. Before anyone called them legends, before the music hardened into history, there were 5 men who didn't yet understand what they were building. The band didn't begin with ambition or mythology. It began with proximity, with long nights that bled into mornings, with learning how to stay locked together when everything else felt unstable. They came together in Toronto, Ontario, pulled from different corners and shaped by different lives. 4 of them were Canadian: Rick Danko, Garth Hudson, Richard Manuel, and Robbie Robertson. The 5th was American, Levon Helm, and from the moment he sat behind the drums, everything found its center. Helm didn't just keep time, he grounded the music. He carried the emotional weight of it. What they played together sounded familiar even when it was new. Americana threaded through folk, rock, R&B, jazz, and country. It felt lived in, like stories passed hand to hand. That sound would quietly reshape artists like George Harrison, Elton John, The Grateful Dead, Eric Clapton, and Wilco. But it didn't arrive fully formed. It was earned, mile by mile. Before they had a name of their own, they were the Hawks. Between 1958 and 1963, they worked as the backing band for rockabilly singer Ronnie Hawkins. Hawkins operated out of Toronto, but his reach stretched across Ontario. He was sharp-eyed and controlling, the kind of leader who didn't compete with talent. He absorbed it. When a promising band showed up on the circuit, Hawkins didn't challenge them. He hired their best players instead. That's how Robertson, Danko, and Manuel ended up under his command. Helm had joined Hawkins even earlier, in 1957. By the following year, fresh out of high school, he became the full-time drummer and followed Hawkins north from Arkansas to Ontario, trading comfort for possibility. One by one, the others followed. Robertson came in, then Danko, then Manuel. Hudson arrived last. For a brief stretch, Stan Seelest was part of the lineup too. At that stage, they weren't equals. They were apprentices, learning what endurance really meant. In the late 1950s, Hawkins, Helm, and Robertson played regularly at Pop Ivy's Summer Garden Pavilion in Port Dover. That room became a quiet hinge point. In May 1961, Hawkins watched a 17-year-old Danko perform there and recruited him on the spot. At the same pavilion, Hawkins and the Hawks saw Manuel sing with his band, the Revels. His voice didn't reach for attention, it claimed it. Hawkins took over managing the revels, then steadily pulled Manuel away, convincing him to leave his band and join the Hawks by September. Hudson resisted longer than the rest. He had a college degree and a clear path toward becoming a music teacher. Rock music, to him, was supposed to stay on the margins. But the Hawks admired his fearless organ playing and kept pushing. When Hudson finally agreed, he did it on his own terms. Each member would pay him $10 a week for music lessons, and they would buy him a new Lowrey organ. From that moment, Hudson became the band's compass. Theory lived with him. Questions landed with him. The sound widened and deepened because of him. With Hawkins, they recorded a handful of singles and earned a reputation as the tightest rock group in Toronto's booming scene. Hawkins demanded stamina. Long club shows were followed by all-night rehearsals, again and again. The grind worked. They grew sharper, faster, more confident, so fast they didn't realize they were outgrowing the container holding them. By late 1963, the tension was constant. They were tired of recycling the same songs. They wanted to write their own. They bristled under Hawkins's fines for girlfriends, fines for marijuana, and the unspoken truth that the ceiling had already been set. Eventually, something had to give. Robertson would later reflect that Hawkins had built them up until they no longer fit inside his music. He had trained them too well. They knew his vision. They wanted another one. So they left. What followed wasn't freedom so much as drift. For a moment, they became the Levon Helm Sextet, adding saxophonist Jerry Penfound. When that fell apart, they reverted to Levon and the Hawks. In 1965, they released a single as the Canadian Squires, then abandoned the name almost immediately. That same year, they crossed paths with blues legend Sonny Boy Williamson, hoping to record with him and become his backing band. The plan collapsed before it could begin. Williamson died shortly after. Then came the turn. In late summer 1965, Bob Dylan was preparing for his first electric U.S. tour. He needed a band that could withstand open hostility and keep playing. The Hawks were recommended by John P. Hammond and quietly backed by Mary Martin, a Toronto friend working as secretary to Dylan's manager, Albert Grossman. Her advice was simple and firm. Dylan needed to hear them. He did. After listening and meeting Robertson, Dylan invited Helm and Robertson to join him. They agreed, but only briefly. After 2 shows, they made their stance clear. They weren't interested unless Dylan hired all of them. Dylan agreed. From September 1965 through May 1966, the Hawks backed Dylan on one of the most volatile tours rock music had ever seen, billed as Bob Dylan and the Band. Folk purists heckled night after night. Dylan pushed harder. Helm absorbed the anger and it wore him down. After just over a month, he walked away, spending much of the next year working on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The recording sessions from that period reflected the strain. Only one usable single emerged. Frustrated with New York studios, Dylan shifted sessions to Nashville. There, Robertson's guitar sliced through Blonde on Blonde, especially on Leopard Skin Pillbox Hat. The rest of the Hawks weren't present. Then came Manchester. On May 17, 1966, at the Free Trade Hall, an audience member shouted, "Judas!" Dylan paused, fired back, then turned to the Hawks with a single instruction. "Play it loud." They did. The moment crystallized into legend. When Dylan suffered a motorcycle accident that July, everything slowed. He retreated to Woodstock. The Hawks drifted back to bar gigs, even briefly backing Tiny Tim. Then Dylan reached out again, this time quietly, drawing them north. In February 1967, Danko, Hudson, and Manuel rented a large pink house in West Saugerties. They called it Big Pink. Inside that house, the pressure finally lifted. The music became casual again. Songs formed without expectations or deadlines. Tapes rolled simply because they could. Those recordings became the basement tapes. And somewhere along the way, the name that had followed them all along finally settled. They were always just the Band. But by 1968, they made it official. From Big Pink to The Last Waltz, how the Band rose, ruled, and finally broke apart. By the fall of 1967, the long, strange chapter with Bob Dylan quietly closed. The sessions ended in October. Levon Helm was back in the fold, and for the first time, the Hawks were standing on their own feet. Big Pink stopped feeling like a hiding place and started feeling like a beginning. Songs began to form there, not as assignments, not as backing parts, but as stories that belonged to them. When it came time to step into a studio, there was still one thing they didn't have: a name. That uncertainty fit them. Stories about how the band became the band never quite line up, which feels appropriate. In The Last Waltz, Richard Manuel remembered tossing around names like the Honkies or the Crackers, a nickname they'd already used backing Dylan at a Woody Guthrie tribute in early 1968. The record label shut that down fast. Robbie Robertson offered a simpler version of events. When they worked with Dylan, everyone just called them the band, and eventually the word stopped being a placeholder and became an identity. At first, they didn't like it. It felt too plain, too exposed. Over time, it started to feel right. Humble on the surface, bold underneath. By 1969, Rolling Stone was calling them the band from Big Pink, and the name no longer sounded accidental. Their first record, Music from Big Pink, arrived in July 1968 and landed like a revolution. Critics heard something different immediately. The album carried 3 songs written or co-written with Dylan, including This Wheel's on Fire, Tears of Rage, and I Shall Be Released. But it was the weight that lodged itself into culture, especially after its use in Easy Rider. The record didn't chase a single sound. It wandered on purpose, and yet it held together. Roger Waters would later call it the second most influential rock record of all time. Writer Al Aronowitz said it sounded like country soul, something he'd never heard before. Momentum followed quickly. In early 1969, they toured, played Winterland, showed up at Woodstock, then crossed the Atlantic to perform with Dylan at the Isle of Wight. That same year, they headed to Los Angeles to record their second album, The Band. Everything about it pushed against the moment it was released into. The cover looked worn in. The songs reached backward into American history. The night they drove Old Dixie down carried the Civil War in its bones. King Harvest told a labor story without dressing it up. Both records were shaped by producer John Simon, who became something close to a sixth member. He helped arrange, played when needed, and fielded endless questions about the horn sounds people assumed had to come from trained players. The truth was simpler. Garth Hudson could play sax, the rest barely could, and the sound came from leaning into limitations instead of hiding them. The attention was relentless. Rolling Stone couldn't get enough of them. Greil Marcus deepened their mystique with every article. In January 1970, they appeared on the cover of Time, the first rock group to do so since the Beatles. Photographs taken for that cover were shelved, forgotten, and only resurfaced decades later in Once Were Brothers, Robbie Robertson, and The Band. Their influence was spreading even as cracks began to show. Eric Clapton and George Harrison openly credited the band with reshaping their musical direction. Clapton even admitted he wanted to join them. He never did, but he pulled them into his orbit later, bringing them together for his 1976 album, No Reason to Cry. After the band, they toured as a headlining act for the first time. Fame didn't sit easily. The songs grew darker. Fear and isolation crept in. Stage fright captured that tension. Engineered by Todd Rundgren, it was recorded at the Woodstock Playhouse. Critics were kind, but the comparison to their first 2 albums was unavoidable. That same year, they boarded the Festival Express, a rolling Canadian tour that turned into a blur of music and excess alongside Janis Joplin and the Grateful Dead. In the footage, Rick Danko sings through a drunken jam as if nothing could touch him. Behind the scenes, something was shifting. Robertson began taking tighter control. Helm saw it as authoritarian and greedy. Robertson saw it as necessary, arguing that addiction was making the others unreliable. He insisted he tried to pull Manuel back into songwriting and watched him slip further into heroin. No one agreed on where responsibility began or ended, and that disagreement never healed. They pushed forward anyway. Cahoots followed, featuring Dylan's When I Paint My Masterpiece, a duet with Van Morrison, and Life is a Carnival, powered by horns arranged by Alan Toussaint. Toussaint's presence changed their sound again and carried into later projects. By late 1971, they recorded Rock of Ages, backed by a horn section and joined on stage by Dylan on New Year's Eve. The music was still powerful. The road was wearing them down. By the mid-1970s, Robertson was done with touring. Commercial expectations weren't being met. Venues got smaller. Then Manuel suffered a serious neck injury in a boating accident. That was the final push. Robertson proposed a farewell. The last waltz took place on Thanksgiving Day, 1976, at Winterland Ballroom. There was a turkey dinner, a horn section, and a guest list that read like a living map of American music, from Ronnie Hawkins and Dylan to Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, Muddy Waters, and Ringo Starr. Robertson's friend Martin Scorsese filmed it all. What it meant depended on who you asked. Helm later wrote that The Last Waltz was Robertson's project, not the band's decision. Robertson countered that he made his statement and stood by it. The disagreement lingered long after the lights went out. On March 1, 1978, after a late set at a solo show by Danko at the Roxy, the original five walked back on stage one last time. They played Stage Fright, The Shape I'm In, The Weight. No speeches, no declarations, just songs that still knew where to land. And that was it. After The Last Waltz, how the band faded, fractured, and finally fell silent. When the band came back on the road in 1983, it wasn't a reunion. It was something quieter, heavier. Robbie Robertson was gone, already carving out a second life. Solo records, film scores, Hollywood rooms where music met money and permanence. What remained was a band determined to keep playing, even if the world they once commanded had moved on. They carried on without him. Jim Wider, a skilled player from Woodstock, stepped into the lead guitar role. The crowds were smaller now. The venue is tighter. The band still headlined. But just as often they opened for former equals like the Grateful Dead and Crosby, Stills, and Nash. There was no illusion about what this chapter was. It wasn't revival, it was endurance. Then, on March 4, 1986, everything collapsed. After a show in Winter Park, Florida, Richard Manuel was found dead in his motel room. He was 42. The band had lived with his struggles for years. Alcohol, drugs, long stretches of recovery followed by relapse. He had been sober for a time, starting in 1978, but by the mid-80s, the old ghosts had returned. This time, they didn't let go. The loss wasn't symbolic. It was physical. Manuel's piano chair couldn't just sit empty. Old friend Stan Celeste stepped in briefly before his own death. And then Richard Bell took over. Bell's history ran deep. He had played with Ronnie Hawkins after the original Hawks split and had powered Janis Joplin's Full Tilt Boogie Band. He knew how to survive chaos. He knew the language. Recognition came unevenly. In 1989, the band was inducted into the Canadian Music Hall of Fame at the Juno Awards. Robertson reunited with Rick Danko and Garth Hudson on stage, backed by Blue Rodeo. Music Express called it a passing of the torch. It looked celebratory. It felt unfinished. As the 1990s opened, Capitol Records began reissuing their old albums, polishing the past while the present struggled forward. Danko, Hudson, and Levon Helm kept touring and kept recording, filling gaps left by death and distance with whoever could step in. In 1992, they stood again behind Bob Dylan at his 30th anniversary concert in New York, playing "When I Paint My Masterpiece" as if time had folded back on itself. A year later, they released Jericho. It was their first studio album since Islands, and the first without Robertson's guiding pen. Outside, writers carried much of the weight. That same year, the band appeared at Bill Clinton's inauguration celebration, a strange but telling moment for a group once defined by the margins. In 1994, they returned to Woodstock for the anniversary festival, and later that year, Robertson joined Danko and Hudson for their Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. Helm didn't come. The arguments over songwriting credits, control, and money had never healed. Absence became its own statement. They kept recording anyway. High on the Hog arrived in 1996. Jubilation followed in 1998, bringing guests like Eric Clapton and John Hyatt into the room. That same year, Helm was diagnosed with throat cancer. For a time, his voice disappeared entirely. When it returned, it sounded different, but it was still his. The band spoke of another album in progress. It never came. Their last recording together was fittingly tied to where it all began. In 1999, they contributed a version of Dylan's "One Too Many Mornings" to a tribute album. It sounded like goodbye, even if no one said it out loud. On December 10, 1999, Danko died in his sleep. He was 55. That was the end. There was no announcement, no farewell tour. The band simply stopped. What remained fractured further. In 2002, Robertson bought out the financial interests of the other former members, except Helm's, giving him control over how the band's story would be presented. Bell died in 2007. In 2008, the group received a Lifetime Achievement Grammy Award. But there was no reunion. Helm marked the night his own way, hosting a midnight ramble in Woodstock, keeping the music alive on his terms. When Helm died on April 19, 2012, after a long fight with cancer, it felt like the final door closing. The drummer who held everything together, who argued hardest, who carried the deepest sense of ownership, was gone. What was left wasn't just a catalog, it was a cautionary tale. Brotherhood that made history, success that pulled it apart, and music that outlived every argument. Robbie Robertson, the roots, the reckoning, and the story that didn't end quietly. Long before the spotlight, before the arguments and the legacy debates, Robbie Robertson began as a boy moving between worlds, trying to understand where he belonged. He was born on July 5, 1943, in Toronto, into a life already layered with complexity. His mother, Rose Marie Dolly Chrysler, carried Cayuga and Mohawk roots and had been raised on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve, southwest of the city. As a child, Robertson followed his mother wherever work and circumstance took them. They lived in several Toronto neighborhoods, settling nowhere for too long. He was an only child, which made the trips back to Six Nations feel even heavier with meaning. There, surrounded by extended family, he learnt guitar from his older cousin Herb Mike. The lessons weren't formal. They didn't need to be. Music came through presence, repetition, and feel. It was there that sound stopped being entertainment and became identity. At night, Back in the city, Robertson listened to the radio like it was a secret doorway. Rock and roll poured in from Buffalo. Blues drifted up from Nashville. He stayed awake to hear voices that sounded raw and unpolished. Voices that didn't apologize. Those late nights shaped him as much as any lesson on the reserve. When he was 12, his mother told him the truth about his father. The man who raised him wasn't his biological parent. His real father was Alexander David Klagerman, a Jewish-American gambler who had died in a hit-and-run accident before Robertson was born. The news landed quietly, but changed everything. Soon after, his mother introduced him to his paternal uncles, Maury and Natty Klagerman. They pulled him in without hesitation. No distance, no explanations required. Years later, Robertson would say they made him feel like family instantly. That mattered. It always did. By 14, he was already restless. He took summer jobs with traveling carnivals, including a brief stint assisting a freak show during the Canadian National Exhibition. The work was rough. The people were raw. The scenes stayed with him. Decades later, they would re-emerge as Life is a Carnival and the film Carney. Even then, Robertson was collecting stories without knowing it. Music followed him everywhere. His first band, Little Caesar and the Consuls, played teen dances and popular covers. It didn't last long, but it lit a fuse. Soon after, he formed Robbie and the Rhythm Chords with his friend Pete "Thumper" Traynor. They renamed themselves Robbie and the Robots after watching Forbidden Planet. Traynor even modified Robertson's guitar, adding antennae and wires to give it a futuristic look. It was playful. It was ridiculous. And it was serious in the way only young musicians can be. The lineup shifted again. The name changed to the Swedes. And then, one night in October 1959, while playing a radio-sponsored show in Toronto, someone important noticed. Ronnie Hawkins joined them on stage for a few songs. He liked what he heard. That moment didn't feel historic at the time, but it was the door. The rest of Robertson's professional story would unfold in public. The band, Bob Dylan, Big Pink, triumph, fracture, and long arguments about authorship and control. But the foundation was already set. A boy shaped by radio static, reserve land, carnival lights, and complicated truths about family. His personal life followed a similarly winding path. In 1968, he married Dominique Bourgeois, a Canadian journalist. They had 3 children together before the marriage ended. Years later, after decades of work, reinvention, and retreat from the road, Robertson married Janet Zuccarini in March 2023. It was quiet, it was late in life, and it came just 5 months before the end. Robertson never fully detached from the world he came from. He supported social causes, lent his voice to artists against racism, and consistently acknowledged his indigenous heritage. That connection wasn't branding, it was personal. He died on August 9, 2023 in Los Angeles after a year-long battle with prostate cancer. He was 80. His longtime manager said he was surrounded by family. Instead of flowers, donations were requested for the 6 nations of the Grand River. Even at the end, the circle closed where it began. Tributes followed quickly. Martin Scorsese, his longtime collaborator and friend, organized a tribute concert in Los Angeles that November. Familiar faces gathered. In 2024, another tribute followed at the Kia Forum. The industry knew what it had lost, but death didn't bring quiet. In May 2024, Robertson's 3 adult children filed a lawsuit against Zuccarini, alleging elder abuse and undue influence during the final months of his life. The claims were painful, detailed, and unresolved. They added a final layer of tension to a story that had always lived between art, control, and consequence. Robbie Robertson left behind music that reshaped rock history, friendships that never fully healed, and a life that refused to be simple. He was never just one thing, and that, more than anything, is why the story still pulls you in. Before death, Robbie Robertson exposed the truth about Levon Helm. Right up until the end, Robbie Robertson knew there was a version of the story people still hadn't heard. Not the romantic one, not the one frozen in amber by nostalgia, but the uncomfortable truth about what really happened inside the band and why the brotherhood between him and Levon Helm didn't survive the music they made together. Before Robertson died in August 2023 at 80, he finally stopped sidestepping it. And what he said didn't soften the edges. Robertson made his name as the lead guitarist and primary songwriter for the Hawks, and later the band. From the outside, it looked like a shared rise. 5 men, 1 sound. But inside the group, the balance was never as even as fans believed. When Robertson walked away in the mid-1970s, choosing survival over loyalty, the break didn't just end a band. It detonated a relationship. From that point on, his bond with Helm turned into a long, bitter standoff that lasted decades. The fault lines were already there when the band staged their final performance together in 1976. The last waltz was meant to be a farewell. Instead, it became a battleground. Directed by Martin Scorsese, the film immortalized the night, but not everyone liked what it chose to remember. In his memoir, This Wheel's on Fire, Helm argued that the final cut leaned too heavily toward Robertson, framing him as the center of the story while pushing the others to the margins. For Helm, it wasn't just about screen time, it was about ownership. That resentment spilt into the ugliest argument of all: money. Helm openly accused Robertson of taking most of the songwriting credits and, by extension, the royalties. In Helm's telling, Robertson and their manager Albert Grossman controlled the publishing while the rest of the band lived on leftovers. Helm said the change in Robertson wasn't subtle. He called it guitar-itis, the moment when one member starts believing everyone else exists to support him. Robertson never denied that he held the reins. He just said there was a reason. In his 2016 memoir Testimony, he painted a far darker picture of life inside the band. According to Robertson, heavy drinking and drug use weren't side issues. They were constant. He wrote openly about Helm, Rick Danko, and Richard Manuel, describing a period when heroin and alcohol were part of the daily rhythm. Robertson didn't claim innocence. He admitted he experimented, but he drew a hard line between trying something and being consumed by it. In interviews years later, he sharpened that distinction. His addiction, he said, was work. While others unraveled, he felt forced into the role of caretaker, handling business decisions, managing Grossman, and keeping the machinery running. He said they leaned on him to take control because someone had to. That control, however, became the very thing Helm could never forgive. By 2020, Robertson was more reflective, but no less honest. He admitted that being in the band sometimes felt like waiting for disaster. On good days, he feared someone might die. On bad days, he watched people insist they were fine when they clearly weren't. He didn't pretend to be a saint. He just believed he was standing when others were falling. When Robertson spoke about leaving after the last waltz, he didn't frame it as betrayal. He framed it as a necessity. He said it was survival time. Helm, he acknowledged, was right about one thing. He did walk away. But what followed hurt more. Robertson said Helm's bitterness didn't fade with time. It hardened. It became part of who he was. The royalty dispute was never truly resolved, even when Robertson claimed he had been generous. offering songwriting credit he didn't legally owe, simply to preserve friendship. Helm didn't see it that way. To him, the damage was already done. Yet the story didn't end in anger. Before Helm died of cancer in 2012, Robertson went to see him in the hospital. No cameras, no audience. Just two men at the end of a shared road. Afterward, Robertson wrote that he sat with Helm and thought about the beautiful, impossible times they had lived through together. He called Helm one of the most extraordinarily talented people he had ever known. He called him an older brother. That final moment didn't erase the feud. It didn't rewrite history, but it did something quieter. It closed the circle. Robertson's truth about Levon Helm was never simple. It wasn't praise or condemnation. It was acknowledgement of brilliance, of chaos, of a brotherhood that created something timeless, then tore itself apart trying to survive it. Do you think the band would have stayed together longer if the songwriting credits had been shared differently? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.